The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. On December 10th, 1905, the writer O. Henry published a story about sacrifice. In The Gifts of the Magi, he describes a young couple who are tight on cash but full of love. The young bride, Della, wants to buy her husband, Jim, a platinum chain for a gold watch that's been in their family for generations. So she goes to a local wig shop where the owner chops off her long, luxurious hair. And with the money she earns, she buys the chain. And that night, when Jim comes home, she receives a gift from him. And she tears off the paper with trembling fingers and opens up the box and discovers that he has purchased her a set of beautifully crafted combs inset with precious jewels for the hair that she no longer has. And when she asks for his watch in order to give him the chain, he reveals that he sold it to buy her gift. And the writer says, each sold the most valuable thing that they owned in order to buy a gift for the other. Now, were Jim and Della the smartest gift givers around? No. But did their sacrifices reveal the depth of their love? Absolutely. And if you've ever loved anybody at any time, you know that it entails some level of self-sacrifice. Especially those of you who are parents know that there is sacrifice that's required to bring another human being into the world and be responsible for them. I remember being in elementary school in suburban Chicago, the fifth of six kids, and one of the neighbors had recently bought a Porsche coupe. And I remember asking my brother, who I believe was in high school at the time, I said, "Hey, Mark, how come Dad doesn't drive a Porsche?" And he said, "That's because he had you and Cindy." And it was a fun little reminder that parents make sacrifices all along the way in order to accommodate their families. Love makes sacrifices. We read this from the Apostle Paul to his letter to the church in Rome. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. If we want to model the love that Jesus Christ has for each of us to others, we got to make sacrifices too. And I believe that this passage identifies 5 sacrifices that love makes. The sacrifice of resources, of comfort, of power, of energy, and of pride. Love sacrifices resources. Paul said, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Now, I don't know anybody who is working with a bottomless bucket of money. Even billionaires have a limited amount of money that they're working with. Nobody has infinite resources. But God has given all of us something that we can share with people who have less. And because we have limited resources, that's why a popular financial personality says, when you budget, every dollar has to have a name. And he's right. But if I'm not careful, the name for every single one of my dollars will be Steve Norman. And I'll be tempted to thinking that I earned that money, or I saved that money, or I was given that money, and all of it goes towards me. When in fact, God is inviting me to think above and beyond myself, my family, my wants, and my needs. Love values people over prosperity. It values dignity over dollars. It values well-being over wealth. And I had the opportunity to live in both the east side of Michigan, in northern suburban Detroit, and the west side of Michigan, here in the Grand Rapids and Holland area. And I learned that on the east side, the temptation was often for people to put their money into visible status symbols, either homes or vehicles or nice toys. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen on the west side, but I'm saying that here in what is often stereotypically Dutch country, the temptation is often not to put your money in your garage or is in a vehicle that sits in your driveway, to put it under your mattress, to save for a rainy day. It's that Northern European immigrant mentality. And I've learned that you can spend your money on status or you can save your money for security, but either way, your resources are still being centered in you, your fears, your insecurities, your worries, your concerns. And 1 John 3 says this, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give up our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother and sister in need but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Dear children, let's not merely say we love each other. Let's show the truth with our actions. Love says money, resources are a conduit for compassion. Most of us have more than what we need so that we can, in fact, out of generosity, serve others well. So love sacrifices resources, but love also sacrifices comfort. Again, in his letter to the Romans, Paul says, practice hospitality. Hospitality is about creating space in our homes and our families and our lives for others to belong. Back when I was a kid, our family would often host international students for the holidays, and sometimes that meant extra work or energy. It was cleaning or making small talk or hanging coats up, and sometimes there were some real cultural challenges that needed to get navigated. I remember one time we hosted an engineer from Saudi Arabia for meals, and when his dad came to visit, he needed a place to stay, so he stayed with us. And because his dad was an observant Muslim and needed to pray, he just did it on our lawn. Now, mind you, this is the late 80s in a very homogenous Chicago suburb. We definitely feel like we got some interesting looks for the neighbors around that time. But hospitality, or in the act of hospitality, love sacrifices comfort so that others can be made to feel comfortable. And it does so without the expectation of honor or compensation. Romans 5 says, God demonstrates his love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Love extends radical hospitality whether or not we believe the other person deserves it or can repay it down the road. So love sacrifices comfort. Love also sacrifices power. Romans 12:14 says, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Context matters here. We believe that Paul is writing this letter not too long after an era where the Roman Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome. And a few years later, they're allowed to return. And we think that the emperor at the time of this writing is Nero, who would go on to do absolutely horrific things to followers of Jesus in that town at that time. So Paul is writing to Jewish followers of Jesus in Rome in that era. And when he says, bless those who persecute you, it is not in the abstract. It is intensely personal because they can put names and faces to their persecutors. So to bless rather than curse an enemy, that's an act of forgiveness. And forgiveness is what occurs when love sacrifices the power of vengeance or revenge. And almost everybody that I know has someone that they could choose to forgive. I've told you before on this show that I've been reading the story of Joseph recently. He was a favored son who was sold into slavery, was wrongly accused of a crime they did not commit, and was ultimately forgotten and left to rot in jail. So the people that he has to forgive are the cupbearer of Pharaoh, a friend that he was in prison with who had the opportunity to spring him out and who didn't. He wronged Joseph through his neglect. He's got to forgive his dad for his favoritism. He's got to forgive Pharaoh and his wife for their deceit and their slander and their cowardice. He's got to forgive the entire system of the Midianite slave trade that was responsible for making him an enslaved person. And he's got to forgive his brothers for an act of spiritual and emotional violence that sold him in the first place. So Joseph's got to forgive individuals and families and strangers and parents and systems and friends. And in the end, 39 years will pass before his first offense and his ultimate closure. And for some of us, our forgiveness journey might not resolve itself as quickly as we want it to. But today, I believe God is inviting some of us to say, okay, God, I'm ready to start my forgiveness journey. Because I'm learning the hard way that if I hate anyone anywhere, I cannot love everyone everywhere. Forgiveness is impossible when we see other people through broken lenses. When I only see them through my human perspective, especially the people who have wronged me, I see monsters, I see threats, I see obstacles to my well-being and healing. But in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says, Christ's love compels us. For we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. So from now on, and here's what I want you to catch, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In Christ, we see others from his perspective. People who are broken, but people who are still valuable. People who are flawed and nevertheless created in God's image. And he invites us to step into the ministry of reconciliation that he modeled so well so that we can see others reconciled to God, people who are reconciled to one another, and people who are reconciled to a world that so desperately needs to know of Christ's truth and love. So love sacrifices resources and comfort and power and energy. Paul says, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. Rejoice with those who rejoice. I don't know about you, but when it feels that I'm not winning in life, it can be hard to rejoice with other people who are having a good day. In a world that's racked with constant comparison and contagious envy, it is hard to rejoice. And somewhere we get stuck believing that life is a zero-sum game, that if somebody is winning, then somebody else has to be losing. And I remember a mentor of mine by the name of Erwick McManus once told me, you don't have to lose for me to win. Love lives with an abundance of celebration. Who doesn't love the kind of person in your life who celebrates all of your wins? My son is playing varsity basketball this year for his high school, and a couple of weeks ago, he just hurled up a desperation three-quarter shot right at the buzzer at the end of halftime. And wouldn't you know it, that shot went in. As fun as it was to watch that shot go in, what was even more fun was to watch all of his friends celebrate that shot with him. One of the first guys to run out and celebrate was a guy who doesn't get a lot of minutes, doesn't get a lot of glory, doesn't get his picture in the news feed. But he ran out there because he loves the game, he loves his friends, and he loves Joe. Love rejoices in and with others, even when it's costly. Mourn with those who mourn. When you live in a culture that doesn't do grief well, it is hard to mourn with those who mourn. Parents, how many times have you ever caught yourself telling your kid, hey, you got to stop crying? How many of you ever have a parent tell you, hey, I need you to stop crying? Why do we do this? Do we do this for our kid? Maybe a little, but I find out that more often than not, we do it for us. Because we say, your drama is annoying to me. Or even if your sadness is legitimate, that's making me uncomfortable. And I would prefer if you stop now. Every once in a while, I'll hear somebody say as they get ready to honor a loved one in a funeral, I hope I can make it through this tribute without crying. And I try to tell them, if there was ever a time to cry, it's now. And everyone who's in that room is going to understand. Not long ago, I heard someone say, I don't like going to memorials. They bum me out. I avoid them if I can. I don't know a lot of people who do enjoy going to memorials, but I know that the people who go to them, even when it's difficult for them, do so because they're trying to support somebody else. I remember I had two colleagues who drove 5 hours round trip from Holland, Michigan to suburban Chicago to be with me for my dad's memorial service. I will never forget the power of that gesture. And now, if I am physically able and it's logistically possible, I will do it for all of the friends that I can. Why? Because love mourns with those who mourn. Love rejoices with those who rejoice. Love sacrifices energy when the circumstances and the relationships require them to do so. And then finally, love sacrifices pride. Paul says, live in harmony with one another. Don't be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Don't be conceited. Hear that again. Live in harmony with one another. How are we doing in the harmony department lately? I would say as a nation, we are struggling at best. And maybe the reason is that if harmony wasn't costly, we'd have a lot more of it. But it is. Harmony demands that I put my positions and my agenda aside to listen to your story, your longings, your heart. The truth is that while pride builds barriers, love builds bridges. Love means that I associate with other people, not for my status or not what I can get from them or out of them, but because out of deep and legitimate concern for their well-being. Love sacrifices status and position and privilege whenever it can. Kelly and I were talking to one of our kids who's in high school about a particular student who was getting mistreated. And the first question that we asked him is, are you joining in on this mistreatment? And they said no. And then our next question is, have you advocated for that person in a meaningful way? And they said, not yet. I'm not exactly sure how. And I think that when you're 15 years old, it can be hard to stand up for somebody that everybody else loves to tear down because it comes at a price. And when you're 14, 16, 17, 19, social capital is incredibly valuable. And for you to throw yourself out there means that you sacrifice your pride or your reputation for another. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. You can either live out of entitlement, which is pride, or you can live out of empowerment, which is love, but you can't do both. You can either elevate others out of love or promote self in pride, but ultimately you're going to have to make a choice. And when we choose to love, we have to remember that we can only love well because Christ has loved us first. 1 John 4:19 says exactly that. We can love because he loved us first. And nobody taught me about sacrificial love quite like Denny Ellens. Denny was the owner of Hudsonville Ice Cream, where I worked briefly in 2020. And just over 2 weeks ago, Denny died unexpectedly. And his memorial service was here in Michigan just a few days ago. There were 13 different people who shared tributes in honor of Denny. And they ranged from a former professional athlete to a CEO, from a first-generation immigrant who is a business owner to a formerly unhoused person. And every single one of them had the same message, that Denny was somebody who modeled humble and abundant generosity. Every single person who shared a story said that they felt deep, tangible, meaningful love from Denny. There was a slideshow during the service, and in it there was a picture of Denny reading a book, Unreasonable Hospitality. And if there was ever a book that Denny didn't need to read, it was that one, because he lived it. He sacrificed comfort and convenience and status and power and pride and energy, all for love. My wife Kelly told me that our son Josiah, who's 17, came up to talk to her a couple nights after Denny passed away, and out of nowhere he said, I've been thinking a lot about Denny. And then he continued to relay all of the different things that Denny did that brought him joy. He let Joe swim in his pools. He took him out for steak when he found out that he loved meat. He offered to let him drive his Lamborghini Urus, which we respectfully declined. He said, for Denny, those are all probably small things, but they meant a lot to me, and they brought me a ton of happiness in those moments. He said, I think Denny got a ton of joy out of making other people happy, and I want to be like that. And Denny consistently modeled for Joe the joy of generosity. And I don't think you have to be a high net worth business owner to have an impact. You just have to be willing to see others the way that Jesus does. And we have to believe Jesus when he said, it is more blessed to give than it is to receive. So I don't know where in your life God is inviting you to make a sacrifice of love, whether it's in your resources or your comfort or your power or your pride. But just spend some time as you head into this week and say, God, where can I give some of me so that some of you can be imparted on someone around me? I think you'll be excited to see what happens when you do. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.